How's it going, everyone? This is James from James Films, and yeah, your eyes saw that correctly. That was a new intro. I figured I'd put something new together for 2021, and so that's what I came up with. It's a fun little playful animation that is actually up on my Patreon if you want to download that. A little plug here. The Patreon for me has been kind of a place for me to dump some of the project files that I can upload, ones that don't use paid assets like grass and trees and stuff like that. So this is a perfect example of something that you'd see up there. I also kind of treat it like a teaching assistant of sorts, where you can ask me questions and I'm happy to make tutorials, send you detailed messages, make tutorials in response to messages that you send, and just have a lot of fun. So yeah, check it out over there if you'd like to see more of my stuff. It also helps support these videos too and allows me to keep making tutorials like this. So thanks for your support. So for this video, I wanted to show you how I made this little render here using primarily Quixel Megascans assets. These are Photoscanned assets like rocks and things like that. They're a lot of fun to work with, and you can really quickly build out a really complex scene with just a couple of these assets. I also use the scatter plugin to scatter a couple particles on the surface, specifically some trees. And then I talk through a bit of the lighting and stuff that I do to really make the scene dreamy and otherworldly. So without further ado, let's get right into this tutorial. And usually I kind of do these as like time-lapse tutorials where I'll just kind of talk over things, but I really like kind of making these longer videos to just talk through the workflow and try to share how I approach editing stuff like this for you. I feel like it's helpful just to see the workflow of other creators. So for a lot of these things, I actually like to start with photo walks outside, where I'll actually just walk around outside to get inspired by nature. But unfortunately, I'm not in the south of France, where I'd rather be right now, instead of freezing in the cold northeast of the United States. So I'm going to be searching up on something called Unsplash for some images from a beautiful national park in Marseille, France, called the Calanque. It's this kind of park filled with all kinds of little inlets like you see here, these beautiful little places where you can go swimming. It's basically like a private pool in nature, which is pretty awesome. So what I like to do is browse for photos and then take one picture or a couple pictures as a sort of mood board to jumpstart my renders. So for this one, I found a picture that I like in particular, which is one that kind of shows a bit of the underwater scene in addition to the overall landscape. So you'll see I saved this to a folder I have where just all my Unsplash pictures are. And I use a lot of these for skies as backgrounds. But what I like to do is drag down this little sidebar here. And then what you can do is, first let me activate the screencast keys. I always forget to do this, and I always get comments saying, hey, can you activate these keys? So activating for you guys, love you guys. Sorry, I forget to do this sometimes, but hopefully this is helpful. You can see what I'm clicking here. But what I like to do is open up the image as kind of a reference image on the side there. What you can do is just make the menu an image editor, and then pull in the image. You can kind of zoom in and pan around in it just using your middle mouse scroll wheel. So I have that there as reference to start my renders. And what I'm going to be trying to go for with this one is that little part you see there where you've got trees around on the rocks, these kind of like tannish almost rocks, and then you've got the nice kind of clear blue water there from the shallow inlets. So I'm just going to fire up Quixel in the background here, have that loading up, and we'll kickstart the scene here. You can just zero out the camera by hitting Alt-R to cancel rotation, and then Alt-G to bring it back to the origin. And I'm just going to hide the cube for now. So just to start off here, I'm going to bring in some rock assets from Quixel Megascans. As I said, this is a really fun program to use. It's got a lot of great photoscanned assets that you can just really quickly pull into any 3D software for that matter. I have it synced with Blender and Cinema 4D, and it's really quick to just import a bunch in. As you see here, it's just working in the background, just packaging the textures and then exporting them to Blender. You've got the little dialog box that comes up there, exporting to Blender, export successfully. We love it when it's successful. That's awesome to see. But I'm just going to pull in a couple of these Icelandic sandy volcanic rocks. It'd be pretty cool to be in Iceland too, but I think these work pretty well as rocks for a Calanque type scene. These kind of almost white, just off-white rocks that you see there. So I'm just going to pull my camera around here. And what I like to do is, I've said this in other videos, is set my camera angle nice and early so I know exactly what I'm going to be trying to build out the scene. You don't want to have any wasted geometry in your scene, usually, because it just kind of bogs down your computer, bogs down your RAM if you have all kinds of geometry in your scene. So usually I like to know exactly where I'm going to be building out the scene. So I set my camera early, I set my render settings early. I usually like to use cycles for my renders, for photorealistic renders. activate the GPU compute, and I've got an NVIDIA GPU, so I can actually activate optics denoising in the viewport, which is really fantastic, and allows me to see through a lot of the noise to kind of a smoothed out image, but still gives me a good idea of the scene, and it's refreshing really quickly. So I'm just kind of preparing these textures. For whatever reason, whenever I import these into Blender, it has the normal map pumped into the alpha channel for some reason. I'm not sure why that is. It wasn't doing that before. Maybe this is just something with my import-export settings that I've got to fix. But, you know, it's a quick little fix, just dragging something with the nodes there. And I'm just going to fire up the render and bring in a environment texture, HDRI. And I'll link this in the description if you want to use this specific one. It's from a great site called HDRI Skies. And I like to just open up my, if you have Node Wrangler add-on enabled, I like to just open up my world texture menu and just rotate this around to get an idea for where I want my light source to be coming from. I've said this in other videos as well, but the HDRI for me isn't enough to really get good lighting conditions. You can really pump that strength up. Usually I try to go for somewhere around 9 or 10 with the strength because I end up using a background image that's different from the HDRI to begin with, so if I'm washing it out, it's not a big deal. But the HDRI for me doesn't provide enough light to my scene, so I'm going to end up adding a sun lamp later from the same direction where the sun source is coming in the HDRI. So you can see I'm adjusting my camera here. I like to kind of change this early, like I said. I like to enable just the render region, so I'm just rendering the stuff in front of the camera, not anything outside, because this will just speed up the viewport rendering. And with Quixel Megascans, you could just really quickly kind of be placing these around, moving them around, rotating, rescaling. And what I'm going to try to do is build something with some nice leading lines, similar to you see in the Calonque there. We've got the leading lines kind of bringing you into the deeper and deeper water of the Mediterranean Sea. So I've got these rocks on the left and right of the frame, and then kind of a more flat profile rocks in the middle. And what I like to do is add all these rocks to a collection that I can really quickly turn on and off just by clicking that little checkbox that you see there. And what I like to do as well to conserve geometry as well is just to duplicate these textures by hitting Alt-D, which basically creates like a linked duplicate, like a reference duplicate of the same geometry. So you're not adding all this extra geometry to the scene. If you're hitting Shift-D, you're creating an entirely new piece of geometry. Alt-D is just a really nice way to just quickly duplicate a whole bunch of the same things over and over. And with Quixel, like I said, you just want to play around and have fun and just fill out your scene. I just duplicate these assets over and over again and just place them around to build out the scene. Always keeping an eye on the right there in that rendered viewpoint just to see what I'm working with, just to see where assets are going to be filling in. Where the eye is kind of being led in the scene. And it's just fun to just play around with these and move them around. It's kind of like a Lego set in a way. You're just plugging little pieces together and creating a big scene. And it's really fun to just do this. I highly encourage you to just play around. I like to make the HDRI transparent in the background. You can do that by just going over to the Render Settings tab and scrolling down a bit and hitting Transparent under the Film tab. Because I'm going to be replacing that sky anyway, it's kind of a little bit distracting to me compositionally while I'm filling this out. So I'm just going to get rid of that and just continue moving rocks around in the scene. You see me constraining the movement as well to specific axes as well, which is good to do just so you're not accidentally bringing the rocks up really high in Z space or putting them elsewhere. So you can just do that by hitting like G and then Shift Z to constrain motion to specific axes, which is, I think, important to do. And again, I'm going back and forth between camera settings and moving rocks around and camera settings. It's still early on in this render, and it's just good to kind of dial these settings in just so you have at least something to work with initially when you're kicking off your render. And yeah, you can continue to adjust this throughout the process, but it's just helpful to know what your composition is going to be like early on. And it's super rough right here. I'm just kind of blocking out shapes and moving things around, just building out the scene. I kind of call this 3D sketching in a way, where you're just kind of painting in the scene in a way with actual 3D geometry, 3D objects. It's just fun to just build things out and just throw things around and kind of see what works and what doesn't. I like to reference that image again just to see what I'm working with, and I feel like I might need some other rocks later on, so I'll probably bring in something else here just to get kind of like a bit of a pointier rock for the scene. So I'm still in my Icelandic rock collections here, and there's this one that kind of looks like it's a spire, lava spire. So I'll bring that one in and use that kind of for the back edge of my scene, just because I think it'll look nice and add a little bit of extra pointiness to the rocks, which if you look in the reference image, you see there are quite a few that are just kind of almost like little towers, little spires sticking out of the Calonque, which is, I think, an interesting look. And that just fills out my composition nicely. So we've got a pretty good scene to work with here. You know, you've got the nice framing with the rocks on the left and right edges of the film, or of the screen. You've got the leading lines kind of bringing you from the shallower rocks deeper on into the scene with a bit of a curve to it. I'm going to bring that HDRI back on just so I can adjust the lighting a little bit more. It's getting a little bit too blue, so I'm going to bring it up again to get a bit more of that orangish color from the lower part of the image to splash that in. I like nice warm images. I'm sure you've noticed this before, but a lot of my images are kind of this dreamy orange glow. So I use that by getting a combination of this HDRI with that nice bright yellow that you see there with the background, and then with a nice sun lamp in the same direction generally where this HDRI is coming from. So I'm liking how that's going to look. So I'm going to bring in a sun lamp at this point and try to match generally the angle that sun's coming from. And you'll notice you're not really seeing too much of an effect just yet here with the sun lamp when you bring it in, because it's set to a default setting of 1 in the brightness. So what you actually have to do is increase that brightness, kind of just punch it up all the way. So I'm just going to kind of crank this up to like 45 or something high. And then I'm going to adjust the temperature of it so it's a bit warmer. And now you can really see where it's hitting in the scene. It's adding this nice shadow to the rocks and adding a lot more depth to the scene. You can really see the geometry of the rocks with this sun lamp. And so that works really well. And you can continue to adjust this around just to get different looks with it. I generally, like I said, try to match the HDRI, the directionality that it's coming from, because it just looks better and makes more sense physically in the scene if it's coming from the same direction, that you'll have shadows in the same general spot as you'd get from the HDRI too. And so yeah, this is looking pretty good. So I think what I like to do here is just to add in some of those trees, you know, to get into the scene. You can see they're kind of all scattered around on the edges of these rocks. So it'd be nice to kind of have some of those trees planting around. So I use the scatter add-on, which is from the Blender Market. It's a lot of fun to use. And you can add in these extra little plugins for them. So I got this one called Junglescapes the other day from the Blender Market, which has got a whole bunch of palm trees and little ferns and stuff like that, which are a lot of fun to use too, and I think look pretty great. I've just started to experiment around with these a lot, and I think they look really great, and they integrate super well with the scatter add-on. So you'd basically just choose which biome you want. For this one, I'm going to be going for kind of a tree like biome, and you just click on it. It's super simple. First click on your geometry with scatter to add it as like an active layer, and then just click on whichever biome you want. I'm just going to go for I guess like one of these tree ones here. So I guess maybe this like top tree here, or one of these ones up here that's like a bit thinner, like this one looks decent. So you just click on it and it takes a second to load in. Sometimes it adds like way too many particles. So for this one, it added a ton of particles. So I'm gonna actually have to pull it back a bit. You can see super cluttered, but it just very quickly added in these trees to the scene. So we've got all those trees added in. And you can just go through and adjust a lot of these settings. I usually bring down the emission count for the trees, since there are way too many. And you can really quickly create some masks in here. So I'm using a paint layer mask. You add the influence to the selected system, and you just paint on your geometry. So for this one, I want the trees kind of in this like front edge here. There isn't really a need for too many trees in the very back corners there. So I'm just going to kind of paint them a lot in this front edge. And you just switch back to object mode, and yeah, there's the trees already in the scene. I'm going to reduce the emission count like a little bit more because there's still too many, I think, cluttering up the scene. And you can just adjust the particle scale too. It brings them up a bit higher. And I just find it really very simple to add in some really awesome foliage to your scene. So I think it's worth it to get add-ons like this. I mean, it does cost money. You know, Blender is a free program, so I feel like a lot of people are reluctant to purchase add-ons. But it just really speeds up your workflow, and it really gets good results very quickly using stuff like this. And it supports good cause, you know, some really great creators creating some awesome stuff for Blender. You know, it's nice to float some money their way for the work that they're doing. It's really advancing the software and making it more of an industry standard type of program. So I'm going to do the same thing for some of these other rocks. I'd like some trees in the foreground as well of my image. And what you'll notice is when I add in the trees for this one, it's actually coming on both sides. It's on that one rock and on the other one that I actually duplicated before and moved over in the scene, which is the effect of having that linked duplicate rather, which is kind of nice. So you can add the trees to both particles or to both objects at the same time. And I like that. I mean, maybe you don't want that, so maybe you'll just actually have to click on the other object and you can deactivate it from there. But it's kind of nice. I like how it's framing the scene. You've got trees on both the left and right of the frame. filling out the scene very nicely. And I'm dialing in the brightness of the sun as well here, because the trees are kind of blocking a bit of where the sun's coming from. So I really have to crank that brightness up a lot. And don't be afraid to crank up the brightness in your scene a bit. I mean, it is important to have proper lighting in the scene. I think the sun lamp does a really great job at killing a lot of noise too when you ramp it up higher. So it looks good. So I mean, don't be afraid to punch those values up quite a bit. We're going to add in some trees to the background here as well. And so those are looking pretty good to start off with. Yeah, I mean, we're having a pretty good scene here. We're kind of filling things out well. So now's the time to maybe add in the water to the scene. So I get a lot of questions asked about how I made this water texture. This is one that I have actually in another project file, so I'm just going to actually append it in and use it for this one. But it's basically using some Voronoi textures mixed together to add kind of like a fake caustics effect. And then I've got a volume absorption plugged into the volume node output of the texture, which kind of gives it that bluish glow and depth to the water as well. So like the further you look down, there's this kind of depth to it. You also have the fake dispersion effect where you kind of see like the red, green, blue channels, especially when like I refresh the image, you can really see what it looks like. And it's just kind of simulating caustics and what water would look like. It's definitely a fake caustics effect because Blender really doesn't do caustics well at all compared to other render engines, unfortunately. So you kind of have to fake it till you make it with the water a bit, but it's looking pretty cool. You know, I also have a displacement plugged on it too to kind of add a bit of like ripples to the water too. And what you can do is hit Control and B to render just a part of the image, because this is going to be really hard to render since it's a transparent surface. Blender doesn't really play well with glass or with transparent objects that well. It kind of adds a lot of noise to the scene very quickly. So what I like to do is often like isolate specific regions of the render, which I know will be problematic areas, dial in the lighting, dial in the textures just to make sure that it looks well in that particular part of the scene. And then you can hit Control Alt B to cancel the render region and get back to looking at the whole viewport again. So now we've got the basic scene. I kind of wanted to work outside in for this one. Usually I work inside out where I actually build a room first and then kind of populate the room. But this one I wanted to pay a lot of special attention to the overall scene, this kind of Kelunk scene. So now we're transitioning into creating a room a bit backwards, but hey, it works. So we're using that default cube. I like to keep this guy around. You know, I always feel bad deleting it. It's just there. It just wants to help. It just wants to be used, right? So let's use it for the scene. I'm just going to create a super simple room and just have that kind of frame the scene, give it a bit of depth to the scene as well. So it's not just this exterior scene. You kind of have this mixture of the indoors and the outdoors, which I kind of find very intriguing with a lot of my renders, is having that mix between the indoors and outdoors. I always add a solidify modifier on top of these rooms, just because you get a bit of thickness to the wall. And when you're using the Boolean tool to cut holes out of it, it often has issues with very, very thin surfaces. So you want to add a little bit of geometry to it. It's also important to flip the normals here, just because you'll notice you can't actually see the faces anymore because they're on the outside of the solidify modifier. And I've got this really nice add-on called the Crown Molding Pack that has just a bunch of really nice bevel profiles. And you can actually add that very quickly to edges on your scene and then go into the geometry tab here. And you can change the bevel profile. So I've got this really nice profile that is like a crown molding type thing. You can make these yourself pretty easily, but this is just kind of speeding up my workflow a bit. And also comes with this really nice tool where you can just scale it up very quickly and kind of move it around the scene. I'm realizing now, I probably shouldn't have added that solidify modifier first because it somehow duplicated the crown molding since it assumed that there are actually two edges instead of just the one. So we're just going to undo this quickly and delete this out. Hey, mistakes happen with these things. You know, you're getting to see the behind the scenes here. Nothing's ever perfect with 3D rendering. There's always little mistakes that you got to resolve here. So I'm just going to click off that solidify modifier for a second here and reselect those edges of the frame. And once again, convert it to crown molding, go back to the geometry tab and load in that profile, and we'll scale it up again. Scale it up quite a bit just because it's a little bit hard to see sometimes in the scene. I really want that to read well as crown molding. Just going to rename this. It's always important to name your layers so you know what you're working with, especially when you have like 1,000 layers in your scene. I'm just going to convert this to a mesh so I can actually add a nice texture to it and control where that texture displays on it. We'll solidify the scene again, just up the thickness just a little bit. You know, you don't need to go overboard with this, like 0.2, 0.3 is generally enough for this. We'll rename this to the house. And now we're going to add in another cube, and I'm going to be using this as a cutting object, as a boolean for the house, to cut a door frame out of this. So we'll push this back in the scene, and what it's helpful to do is just make the visibility on this a wireframe, so you can actually see what you're working with in the viewport a bit better. And so I kind of want this to be pretty large, so I'm just going to scale this up a bit, make sure it's going through the bottom, it's not clipping. And we're just going to scale this along the Y and the X a little bit so that it takes up a bit more of the frame. So that's looking pretty good. I probably will adjust this, and in fact I do adjust this a bit as I go, but first let's just cut it out of the scene first. So we'll make it a boolean, and then just click on it, and then bam, you've got a door. Look at that. So I rename it as a cutting object just so I know what I'm working with here. And I'm just going to disable its visibility in the viewports and the renders, so that when I open up cycles again here, it doesn't just display as the cube itself, it's just going to show me that cut hole. Take a second here to load in. There's a lot to calculate now with the extra geometry, with all the scattered objects, with the water and everything. So now we've got this scene. It's looking pretty good. I think it's clipping like a little bit too much of the scene there. It's a little bit too low, so I might actually adjust the camera angle a bit here, and then also the position of the cutting object. But first I'm just going to actually drag this back a little bit here because I'm noticing a little bit of brightness coming in on that left side of the frame. So I'm just going to pull the house back so that I kind of kill that off a little bit, so that the camera isn't picking up so much of that brightness from the edges. Yeah, so looking pretty cool. You know, we got a house, kind of an abstract scene going on here. We got the nice trees, we got the rocks. I want to make sure that the trees aren't getting like clipped too much by that door frame of the house, and it doesn't appear to be. I'm just going to click the water back on, and that's looking very dark right now, way darker than before. It's kind of a bit spooky almost, which I do not like. I kind of want this to look more like a sauna, kind of more like a dreamy, nice place. But first, let's just resolve the issue with the trees here. So I'm once again doing Control B and kind of zooming in on that one specific problematic region just to make sure that the trees aren't clipping. And at first glance, it looks okay. I mean, it probably is clipping a little bit. Oh, let me turn back on those screencast keys for you guys. That somehow got turned off when I reopened the program. So we got that going again. But yes, you notice it's looking fine at first glance. I think it's going to be okay. When I render this out, you're not even going to really notice it, especially with volumetrics coming in. So that's good to go. But let's adjust some things with the camera, with the lighting. I think it's a little bit too dark, like I said, with that water. So the camera, the sun is kind of coming in at a pretty sharp angle down here. So I'm just going to move this up. This doesn't do anything to the positioning of it by moving the sun up, but the rotation is the only thing that's actually affecting the directionality of the sun lamp. And I'm just going to pull this up a bit so that you have more light coming into the foreground of the scene. And that's looking much better. You've got much more light reflecting off that water, which looks really nice. And you still have a nice light hitting that right edge of the building, which I think really draws your eye in well. I'm going to adjust a little bit with the camera here just to get a better, I don't know, better focal length on it, better view of everything. I think like, I don't know, 28 millimeters works pretty well for it. It's pretty decent. We might adjust the angle a bit here. We'll see. Maybe adjust the brightness and the saturation of the sun lamp a bit here. And this is all just kind of playing around with things. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer here. This is all just personal preference. So whenever you're making your renders, just take this time, take this extra time to really dial in your lighting. Do not rush it. I really think this is one of the most crucial parts of any scene is lighting. It really makes a scene either really terrible or it can really make it stand out if you spend that extra couple minutes to really dial in the lighting. So take the time to do this. It's really important, guys. I cannot stress this enough. I'm just going to change the saturation, a little bit of the volume absorption that's plugged into my water node here, and just make it like a little bit bluer, just because I don't think that's reading quite as well anymore in the darker color. So that's looking pretty good here. Again, this is all just personal preference, just changing settings, making things look pretty. These things really do go a long way in making your scene look pretty awesome. And what I'm going to do now is actually texture the house itself. So I'm just going to re-enable the cutter here, and let's just move it up a bit more just to make it look a bit better, because it is, I think, clipping a little bit too much of the top part of that scene, which I do not like. I think it looks a little bit better when you kind of pull it up that way. And I'm just going to apply the solidifying boolean, and now we can actually just delete that cutter object and then select everything in edit mode and then do smart UV project for the house. I just think this works pretty well. I don't know why, I just like to do this one. I'm going to do Smart UV Project as well for the crown molding. And I'm going to fire back up Quixel Megascans again. And this time I'm going to bring in a really nice texture. It's kind of like a plaster texture with like some kind of cracks to it for the house and for the crown molding. So I'm going to go over to the surfaces, and you'll see just as easy as it was to import those 3D assets, it's really easy to import textures too. So I'm going to use this chipped plaster wall. It takes a second to export. Now I can just click on my house, and then there it is, chipped plaster. You can load that in, and it already applies all of the texture nodes to the scene. So there you go. There's a couple things you might need to change. Sometimes it uses generated for the texture coordinates, so I'm just going to plug in UV instead so I can use that UV projected scene that I made. And once again, that normal map, for whatever reason, is plugged into the alpha. We love it. So let's just put that into the normal again. So that's looking pretty good. I think what happens here is the scale is way off on the textures. So what's important to do is actually make sure that the scaling is right on the UV. But first, actually, I noticed something interesting. The lighting coming in from that roof looked quite nice. So I'm going to duplicate the house just so I have a copy of it if I want to revert back to that original, and then disable it in the viewport. I'm just going to delete the roof. Let's raise the roof, baby, and delete that roof and let in the light. And so this looks actually pretty cool when I tested this out initially. And I think it adds in a little bit of extra light to the water as well too, that we were kind of losing before when we added in the house in the first place. It might be a bit strange to have crown molding kind of just like floating a bit in the air there, but you know, what is even real in life anymore? And the scene is kind of surreal to begin with. So suspend your disbelief a little bit for me, please, when judging this, and just having that crown molding floating there. So yeah, it actually looks pretty cool. I mean, you got the trees poking through the ceiling as well too, which is kind of nice. You just have the framing of the house to kind of ground you a little bit in reality, which is I think pretty cool to do. I'm just adjusting the camera angle here. It's nothing too major, just to lift it up a little bit because I really want to show those trees kind of poking through the ceiling a bit more. And now is what I was talking about with the UV editing. I think it's important to scale these up so that the texture doesn't look huge on your screen. I'm doing the same thing for the crown molding. I'm going to apply that texture. I'm just going to actually disconnect the color because I want it to just be one solid color and just have it driving just the bump basically and the roughness of the scene. I'm going to apply that texture to the plaster or to the crown molding as well. And we're going to go into the UV editor and just scale this up by 3 as well too. So that looks pretty good. We got a nice textured scene here. And now this is kind of like the finishing steps here where I just kind of dial things in, change things up, maybe add some more particles in, and actually add in a image as a plane as a background. I have it set to emit, and then we'll just load in a sky here. And I'm going to try to match it to this kind of nice blue sky that you see in the reference image as well, because I think that works well. I really don't like how HDRIs generally look as backgrounds. I think it's better to use an image as a plane. The one issue is you kind of have to blend it well with the scene, just because it could be like a bit different color, different luminosity. And let's actually use an image from the catalog as well as a background. So I'm just going to import this one as a plane. And one of the first things you actually have to do is go over to the ray visibility and uncheck shadow. Otherwise, it's going to be blocking light passing through it. You want light to still pass through it. Otherwise, it's basically just like a solid block blocking whatever light's coming through. So that's a quick gotcha thing there. I'm just going to scale it up so it's in the background. I'm actually going to flip this 180 degrees because I'm noticing that the brighter portion of the image is kind of on that right side initially. I want it to be on the left, matching the direction of our sun. And I'm just going to scale this up and bring it up. And you'll notice that it looks really dark in relation to our lighting in the scene when I bring this in. And this is what I'm talking about with kind of matching it with the scene. But you can really quickly just up the strength in the emission, and that looks a lot better. Just bringing it to a strength of 4 matches it pretty well with the scene. So we've got a better background. We've got the nice composition set up here. So one of the last things I like to do is actually just add in some volumetric lighting to the scene. And I've talked about this in previous videos. I often get asked a lot of questions on how to make really, really good volumetrics for the scene. And one of the keys to doing it is actually having something like a gobo or trees or something blocking the light path. So you'll notice I have all these trees on the left side of the frame, which is blocking the light coming in. And that works really well to kind of scatter the light. So it's not just this solid beam of sunlight coming into your scene. You've got a bit of breakup of it as it comes through in the volume. So it scatters super well. You've got these kind of individual particles looking really nice. And we'll just bring in a cube and get this started up here. I scale this up pretty big to cover the scene, kind of bring it a bit back a bit. You can scale this up quite a lot. I mean, it's just adding some extra volume to the scene. And I also like to just rename things as well, just so I know I'm working with volume. And we'll bring this down to display as a wire in the viewport so you kind of see your scene still where it is. We'll delete the principled BSDF and add in a principled volume instead. Rename this to volume and then connect the volume output to the volume output on the texture node. I like to bring up the brightness all the way, and then we'll change the saturation to a bit yellowish and just bring down the density. I mean, it's way too dense on the default at 1. Even at 0.1, it's still super dense. So, I mean, feel free to bring this number down quite a bit, like 0.02, 0.01, even like 0.001, just for a touch of volume, I think works well. You're going to want to crank up your render samples quite a bit if you're adding in volumetrics to your scene, just because otherwise it's going to be really noisy. It's a lot of light bounces when you add in these volume scatters to your scene. And also just really make sure your sun lamp is bright enough. I can't stress this enough. When you're adding in volumes, it's important to have enough light passing through. Otherwise, your scene's going to get really dark when you add in the volumes, unless that's something you're going for. If you're going for a nice moody scene, by all means, keep that sun lamp darker. But I think this is looking pretty good. I mean, we've got this beautiful beam coming in. You can't really see the full effect of it because I have that optics denoiser set on. So it's kind of blurring out a bit of the scatter. But once I actually render this out and bring it into Photoshop, it's going to look really nice. So I think this is pretty much it. We can basically call the scene quits at this point and then cook it out in a render and bring it into Photoshop. But this is really quick to do. I mean, just with Quixel, you saw very quickly moving things in here. Quixel's got a huge amount of resources, all kinds of 3D assets from like cool historical things, you know, little gates and benches and columns and whatnot, even hay bales, to really nice surfaces and plants and stuff that you can really quickly import and bring into your scene. I think it's a lot of fun to use, and it's, like I said, it's a lot like kind of like a Lego set. You're building something together with a whole bunch of different assets, and it's fun to just kind of place them in the scene and work off that. So yeah, we'll call it there for this scene, and then render out and bring it into Photoshop. And I'll talk a bit about the pretty minimal, honestly, adjustments that I make in Photoshop. I like to have my scenes basically in a finished state in Blender by the time I bring it into Photoshop, so I can just basically adjust the levels a bit in the scene and kind of adjust a bit of the overall, I guess, saturation of the scene. You know, it's important to not have to fix too much stuff in post. I kind of like to have it as completed as possible. And you can see I'm just adding in a bit more particles here for the trees in the background just because I like having that filled out a little bit. Otherwise, it's getting a little bit too washed out back there. So just with a couple more trees, I think that does the trick. So we will fire this render off, and this took about, I guess, like 20 minutes to render or something. I rendered this obviously with a lot of samples, 2,000 samples, just to kill a lot of the noise that I was going to be getting from the volume from both the water and also from the volume itself. And you can see it looks pretty nice, but it's kind of washed out in Blender, or in Photoshop rather. So what I often like to do is just first add in a levels adjustment and kind of dial these little points in here a bit just to crush the scene a little bit more, add a little bit more contrast to it, kind of brighten up the highlights a little bit more so it's a little bit more dreamlike. I like to add in a warming filter as well. Sometimes it gets a little bit too cold, I think, coming out of Blender. I'm just going to save this out. And I like to use like these color lookups too, but just a little touch of it. I mean, you can really overdo it a bit here in post-production. So it's important to kind of keep your effects within reason. So really be playing around with the opacity of these things. I mean, opacity of like 10% on these is often enough just to give it that little extra edge. I also like to kind of label my adjustment layers just so they're all nice and color coordinated. Add in a little bit of extra brightness to some parts of the image, decrease the contrast maybe a bit just because I think we're losing a bit of that foreground where it's a little bit dark. But again, I mean, these aren't really major adjustments. Like, it's just kind of moving a couple dials back and forth for brightness and levels and whatnot. And I mean, this is already looking like much better than what it was before. You've got a lot more contrast to the scene. And what I actually use at this phase is something called the Nick collection. And it's something that I think Google developed, I want to say, a couple years ago. I've talked about this before in videos. But it has like a lot of nice kind of like filters and stuff that you can dial in. So I'll just merge all my adjustment layers and the base layer into one, make it a smart object. I'll call it final filtered. We'll convert it to a smart object. And then we can go to filters and then Nick collection. And then I first use the analog effects one, which kind of gives this like film camera look to it. And again, I often find these to be like way too extreme. Like that looks insane. Looks pretty terrible, honestly. So you just kind of have to go into the submenus and dial things back a bit so that it's just a very, very, very subtle effect. I turn off the dirt and scratches. I bring down the sliding bars on this a lot. I don't like how much grain it's adding to it. The lens vignetting is like pretty extreme, so let's bring that back quite a bit. And I mean, this is already looking like much better. It's adding a lot more contrast to the image, kind of brightening up parts really nicely. And this is just pretty quick to do, like just a couple dials and things that you need to kind of move here to get the scene looking pretty good. You can click on and off this compare thing too, which I think is pretty helpful to get a quick glance at what your image originally looked like and kind of the adjustment you're making. And it's super subtle what I'm doing here, honestly. This really isn't doing too much, but it's just this little extra oomph to the image that really takes it to that next level. And that's a lot of what this is, honestly. I think with post-production, it's just kind of taking that image just the final step of the way to really make it dreamlike and really exceptional. So this is looking pretty nice. I'll hit OK to apply these filters, and you can always deactivate these later in the Smart Filter tab. But I'm going to add a second Nik collection thing in called the color effects. And for this one, you can add in something called the Orton effect, effectively, which is like blurring the image using a Gaussian blur and then selectively brightening it up. So you kind of have this like glow effect to it. There's all kinds of tutorials on YouTube to do this. But this is basically what I'd like to do with this final stage here, is just add that bit of glow and kind of haze to the image, which you usually will have quite a bit from the volumetrics anyway, but this is just adding it like an extra step. You can add in nice graduated fog. You can see it's just a very subtle effect, but it kind of lowers the contrast a bit in the foreground. You can add some of that contrast back in selectively. You can see I'm changing my music because Hudson Mohawk's music is fantastic. Got to listen to that for the final stages here. Dialing in the contrast here a bit can just really take that image an extra way too. This is selectively adjusting the contrast too, which I think looks really nice. And then the final filter I like to add in is this like sunlight filter, which is basically the Orton effect that I was describing, where it basically like adds a ton of glow or haze to your scene. And this is super extreme too. Like this looks pretty fake to me, honestly, when you add this in initially. But I keep it at its default settings and kind of just slide things around and then just dial it back a bit again. And this is the final result we got. I mean, it's pretty nice. This is a pretty quick little exercise here in playing with the Quixel Megascans assets. I had a ton of fun with this. I hope you guys did too. Hope you guys learned something. If you'd like to see more tutorials like this, support me over on Patreon. It really means a lot to me. It definitely helps me continue making videos like this. If you have any specific questions, I'm always happy to answer them over on the Patreon. And I try my best in comments too on YouTube here to answer whatever you guys come up with. But thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more. Hit that bell icon to be notified when I release a new video. And share this with your friends. And I'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much.